Okay, now for the moment where we hold our breaths, and instead of boring interviewers like me, we go to people who are usually much more direct in what they say. What are you seeing in the blogosphere, Jeff?
Well, I've just been watching what people have been saying on Twitter all day, and getting a sense of what the different conversations are. And as you're talking about adaptation, I just thought I'd bring up one thing. There's a comment on here from someone who's clearly paying attention to the media around the talks. And he says, somehow it's like we'll stop climate change and adaptation won't be necessary. Do you feel like the media is not giving enough focus on adaptation and people are getting the wrong message here?
I think to some extent that is correct. The media is focusing on mitigation because that's the contentious issue. As I said, adaptation within the framework of the negotiations is no longer a contentious issue. It's agreed it needs to be done. It's agreed that it needs to be supported in the developing countries. The question is how much funding support will be made available by the rich countries for the poor countries to do it. But there's no disagreement. Nobody says it shouldn't be done. Nobody says they shouldn't be helped. There is a consensus, and that's not a media story anymore. Whereas the mitigation issue is a media story, is how much are they going to do and who's going to do how much is still unresolved. And the media obviously pick on that. So I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing.
But you say the money for adaptation is still an open question. And to me it seems like that is an enormous question and a very contentious one. So why isn't that being covered?
Well, the money question in general is a contentious one and is being discussed. But what happens with the money question is that it tends to get amalgamated across all the climate change sectors. So when they talk about 100 billion, for example, it includes mitigation, it includes adaptation. They don't actually say how much for each. They just say it includes everything. Then it also includes the private sector and it includes the public sector. Again, they don't say how much on each. So the money game, if you like, is a very confusing game as well, in which some sides want to sow confusion and give these big amounts without specifying how much is going to be for adaptation. And you're right, the countries that are particularly concerned about the adaptation funding, particularly the least developed countries and the vulnerable countries, the ones that I work with, are particularly concerned about adaptation funds, not about mitigation funds, because they're not going to get the mitigation funds. Mitigation funding is going to go to China and India, and everybody knows that. But the poorer developing countries are interested in how much for adaptation. And that's the question they're asking. They're not getting a lot of answers right now.
Is this when Ivo de Boer gave one of his many press conferences, he seemed to spend half his time giving press conferences, he mentioned aid wash. He didn't expand on it, but I'm taking it to mean that when aid is given, the money for adaptation, which is supposed to be above and beyond aid, will not be muddled up. And it seems there is a very serious danger of this. Even from my own country, Britain, the government has said they're going to allocate a percentage, perhaps 10% of aid money to climate change. How are we going to know whether this is extra money or not, or it's just in the aid budget?
This is a very good question, and indeed a serious concern for those who work in the development sector, that the donor countries who are currently providing official development assistance might start double counting money that they now claim to be giving to adaptation, but then also claim it as development assistance, so it's really no new money. There are different views within the donor community or the richer countries on this. Some of the countries, for example Sweden and Denmark, who have actually met their 0.7% target for development assistance.
Sorry, that's 0.7% of gross domestic product.
So they are quite keen and supportive of the demand from the developing countries that any funding for climate change and adaptation be over and above the 0.7%. But for countries that haven't reached their 0.7%, countries like Germany and the UK, for example, who may be at, say, 0.3% at the moment, for any additional money they provide for climate change, they are wanting to double count it as going towards development assistance as well as climate change. And that's something that developing countries don't want to happen. On the other hand, how to ensure that it doesn't is a very difficult question.
Is this, how real is the problem? I don't want to ask you a silly question, but you, I know, go back to Bangladesh and come back and are talking to many people who now are studying adaptation. How real is it around the world? I mean, I've read that climate change is undermining efforts to reduce poverty and hunger, this is a quote from someone, and posing a threat to the Millennium Development Goals. Is this real or is this being hyped up?
I think what we're seeing in reality around the world, and this is not confined to the developing world, it's happening everywhere, is a very significant shift in weather patterns compared to the last century. It's happening everywhere, and people are realizing that. Now, what we cannot do is attribute all of it, or each event, to human-induced climate change. But what it does provide is a very, very strong indication that we are already living in a globally warmed world. The temperature of the atmosphere over the last century has gone up by 0.7 degrees centigrade. It will go up by another 0.7 degrees over the next decade or two, inevitably, because of the lags in the system. And therefore, we are facing a new world which will be a globally warmed world with impacts, and everyone will have to face them. And we are seeing them across the globe everywhere. This is very, very strong evidence for that.
Are some governments have they started taking adaptation measures already? Because presumably you can get on with the job while you're waiting and hoping for some assistance.
Absolutely. I think we are beginning to see that. And interestingly, we're beginning to see it start initially from the least developed countries, who started off doing national adaptation programs of action, or NAPAs, to identify the vulnerable areas and the adaptation actions. And some of them have started implementing them, and some of them have moved on beyond them. To give you one example, from Bangladesh, where I come from, after they did the NAPA, they were one of the first least developed countries to do a national adaptation plan. They then moved on to a national climate change strategy. And in the last budget, the cabinet, when that was presented to the cabinet, the finance minister of the country said, this is so serious, we shouldn't be waiting for international funds to come. And he allocated $50 million from the national budget to implement the climate change strategy. So many countries are now taking this quite seriously and moving forward without waiting for the international community to act first.
Okay, this is interactive. It's OneClimate.net at Copenhagen, so it's back to Jeff for the interactive part.
Sure, I just want to mention to everybody that we are broadcasting live on OneClimate.net, and you can post your questions for Saleem or any of our guests throughout the day in the little box right below the live stream at OneClimate.net. We just have one question for you here, Saleem. We've been talking a lot about governments and their responsibilities. Danny and I actually last night at dinner were talking about what's the recourse if the governments say they're going to do something then don't live up to their responsibilities, and whether or not there's anything to hold, really any international way to hold governments to account. And Richard Klein has just posted this question that's related. He says, Saleem, do you see any scope in linking international climate policy with the legally binding international human rights regime? And the Maldives are suggesting this, but it isn't on the agenda here at the COP.
It's a very good question, and he's quite right. The legally binding nature of the Framework Convention is in the order of penalties that can be applied in the Kyoto Protocol, for example, if countries fail to reach their targets. And that's about as much as the convention and the protocol have in terms of teeth. The human rights issue is something that some countries, particularly the Maldives and others, are trying to raise at the moment. It's unlikely to get recognition in a Copenhagen phase, but certainly in a post-Copenhagen phase, we may see the human rights issue coming into it, particularly if we, over the coming years, find very strong evidence for actual harm being done from climate change. When we talk about adaptation, we are still talking about reducing the impacts of climate change. But once they've happened and ecosystems have been lost and lives have been lost, then they can't adapt anymore. Then it's a matter of compensation and asserting blame and liability. Those aren't built into the Framework Convention, but they're going to have to be in the future if we come to that stage.
Can you name any, are you prepared to name the goodies and baddies here? Are some countries really getting on with the job of adaptation, or do they seem serious about supporting developing countries who are trying to adapt, or there's some holding back?
Well, I think what you're seeing now in the developed countries, until very recently, there was a widespread view that they didn't need to adapt. Climate change impacts would happen in the poor, they're the ones who would suffer. Rich countries are rich enough to ride the storm and get through it. That now they realize is wrong. And even in the richest countries in Europe, in Japan, in the United States, they are now looking at impacts of climate change and developing their own national adaptation strategies. Now, they're doing it not because the UNFCCC is telling them to do it or the UNFCCC is offering them money to do it. They're doing it to protect their own citizens. And if they don't protect their own citizens, then they'll get booted out of office. So the dynamic, in particular for the developed countries to look at adaptation, is different from the dynamic in the developing countries, but they are realizing that eventually they are going to have to face the impacts of climate change as well, and they're going to have to adapt. And that's a new dimension of the problem that we didn't have until very recently.